But it's my pleasure to introduce Pamela Johnson, who many of you will know already, and Francis Spufford, the man reading over here. Likewise. Pamela's third novel, Taking in Water, which she's going to talk to you about, is very interesting about various things, the 60s, coastal erosion, art, and much besides. Francis's novel, Golden Hill, has been described as his first novel. But
it's my first novel in this country, my second novel in the United States, mysteriously.
Well,
my 1.5 novel on average.
Yes. This is the category description problem surrounding Red Plenty, which if any of you have read, and you should if you haven't, you could tell while reading it that there was a man who wanted to write fiction. Because some of it was fiction, but categorised mostly as non-fiction. Anyway, Pam's going to read first, Francis second, there'll be time for questions. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's quite unnerving really, but quite wonderful to see friends and colleagues and ex and current students. It's unnerving because Francis and I were just saying we've only met really to mark, and here we are. I feel like, okay, so now it's my turn to put my work out for inspection. Our books are very different, but I was looking and found some correspondences. We both have a protagonist who withholds a secret to the very end of the book. We both go to New York, although 250 years apart, and Francis's protagonist has to negotiate high society in 18th century New York, and my character is negotiating the art world in the 1960s, but there endeth the similarities. So some of those we could take up maybe in Q&A. So as Blake said, it's my third novel, and with this, the challenge I set myself was to write a character who couldn't possibly be me, or who had experiences that I couldn't have had, and yet find material about which I was curious and which had some kind of connection to my core interests as a writer. And I found myself drawn to real events. There was the hotel on the Yorkshire coast that fell into the sea, which obsessed me for quite a while. The 1953 floods, that was the worst peacetime disaster the UK had ever suffered, but kind of got written out of history. And in researching that, I was surprised to find the parallels with 9/11. One's a natural disaster, one's man-made. They both came out of the blue without warning. One was written out of the national history, one is kind of inscribed and creates the global narrative. But the casualties for both were surprisingly similar. If in 53 you take Britain and Holland, because it was the North Sea that devastated the land, similar level of casualties. I also knew that my main character Lydia would have had a brush with the art world in the 60s, and I wanted to explore ideas that I touched on in my work in the art world, looking at work that is at borderline between purely conceptual and the made thing. This led me to look at the work of Yves Klein, and then on to Yuri Gagarin's first manned spaceflight and his unprecedented encounter with nature, and this idea of the Earth being a tremendous blue. So how on earth was I to make a novel out of all of that material? Well, it was a kind of collaging process initially, finding associations, and then led me to imagine or invent the work of art that is called Taking in Water, the performance piece that's kind of at the heart of this. But the title for that came very late in the day, and anyway, we can talk about some of that, because now I'm going to read a few extracts with saying a little bit more as I go along. So it's set in Yorkshire and in New York. It travels between 2002, which is the kind of real-time of the real-time frame and the 50s and 60s. 2002, because that means it's coming up to, for Lydia, coming up to 50 years since the sea smashed through her grandmother's bungalow and killed her family, but left her with holding on to a pretty terrible secret. I was curious not to go back to 1953, but to how had she survived with what had happened. So she lives alone on a remote bit of the Yorkshire coast, high on the chalk cliffs. She's an artist, and as the book opens, significant objects from her past have begun to wash up on the shore. So this is the opening of the book. "It's the gate," Lydia said out loud, relieved to have identified the source of the noise. She removed her eye mask, and as the lighthouse beam passed over the window, checked her clock. 2 a.m. The banging gate meant a storm on its way. She'd have to shut it. She couldn't afford a sleepless night if she was to get up and on with her search before high tide tomorrow. Wide awake now, she was alert to every sound. The gale coming in off the sea plucked at the roof timbers. A creaking above her that snatched the years away, each gust pitching her back to Grandma's until she's 7 again. Peeping through the letterbox, watching the sea swallow the road, spray leaping above the garden gate, and wondering how a gate could ever keep out the waves. Pulling the duvet over her head to deaden the sound, she shut her eyes and called up the wreck. It was the only way to stop images of that night filling her head. No bodies, no funerals. So she'd made herself imagine the wreck because she couldn't bear to think of her family forever drifting, pulled apart by the currents. There's no wind, no rain, no weather at all on the bottom of the sea. She liked to think of them serene on the sea floor, gazing through swishing curtains of fish. Her wreck is rusted, encrusted with barnacles, but it's solid, bedded in the soft sand of Dogger Bank, out there where the sea is shallow. Luke was the only person she ever told about her ghostly wreck. Her telling him a fantasy led to the art they'd made, and a different kind of storm. She'd never managed to tell anyone about the other images that lived in her head. Images of that night that she didn't make up, that had taken years to surface, that she didn't want to invade her right now. Her father climbing on the table, prodding the ceiling with a poker, and her looking down on Grandma's sitting room, and the sea rushes in to grab an armchair, and the table's floating like a boat. Everything's floating. Grandma's spectacle case, father's trilby, the doll's arm. Images that flickered like stills from a film out of order until she had to hum that tune, that silly hymn. Otherwise, the images might splice together and speed up towards the last frame. She didn't dare run the whole film. Not yet. If she could make this new work, well, maybe then she could finally admit what happened. A drumming on the skylight cut in and told her the downpour had arrived. She'd have to tog up if she was going to fix the gate. Here, she was hundreds of feet above the shore. There was no chance of any waves forcing themselves through her gate, however big the storm. And a storm meant more stuff was being washed up at Slayton. There'd be plenty to find after a night like this. Downstairs, she pulled on her fleece and a waterproof and stuffed her feet into cold wellies. Torch, she muttered to herself, then remembered, bugger, it's in the studio. Well, the lighthouse beam would have to do. If she didn't get out there soon, that gate would be off its hinges. So that's the opening. The Luke who was mentioned there is the older man who she ran off with as a teenager, an artist who she worked with in the 1960s in New York. But now, for Lydia, making art is a way of circling around the hidden history, the hidden event that she can't actually face putting into words, that sometimes she's not sure did happen or what her responsibility was. And And the new objects that have washed up, she thinks they've put her under a sort of creative pressure that is both exciting but unnerving. There are two other viewpoint characters, but I'm going to stick to Lydia in these readings. Martin, who comes to research her past and her role in making the performance piece Taking in Water with Luke, and Stephen, one of the surveyors who's looking into the coastal erosion around her home. And it's these three pressures that gradually force to the surface the things she doesn't want to name. So one of her coping strategies, and this I found when I was researching the 1953 flood, and one of the survivors who said that every day he walked along the shore and waved his fist at the sea, and he continued to do that. So I thought, well, how would she deal with the sea? And over the years, she has outfaced the sea by swimming, by daring to swim, and she swims every day. To remind herself really of its indifference. So this is just a very short section which gives you her landscape and her habit of swimming, I suppose. She scrambled down the small bay, dwarfed by chalk cliffs. Above her, puffins fluttered, gannets swooped and cried. The tide was right. Swimming safely was all about timing, knowing where to leave your clothes and where the water would be by the time you'd finished. She waded up to her knees, her feet and shins hardly registering the cold. The next breaker would reach her waist. She inched forward, waiting for the shock against the soft inside of her thighs. Her knees folded, plunging her shoulders under, a divine iciness that burned. Numbness below, as if her legs didn't exist, for they must be doing something. She was travelling away from the shore. First swim of the year. Stiff-muscled, out of practice, but then reaching, stretching. Her body soon remembered. Out in the bay, she didn't look back. All that mattered was hugging the water, staying intimate with its inhuman bulk. And then, so that idea of the body remembering actually is integral to the performance piece at the heart of this. And as she talks to Martin, the researcher who comes, she begins to see that in a new light. I'm going to read from a section now, which is a bit of a change of pace, because trying to sort out this collage and the structure for this book, I drew upon some work I'd done for the British Library, the oral history collection, the sound archive. So Martin, the researcher, does this kind of interview, and it's not like a journalistic interview. You have to stay very quiet, you have to kind of prompt people, and as they talk, it's extraordinary actually. People who don't want to talk, like Lydia, actually once you get them talking, it becomes kind of compulsive. So using that kind of interview offered me a change of texture. I put some of the interviews in as transcripts, which would allow the reader into the first person, Lydia talking in the first person. So this section is Lydia, aged about 18, talking about her time in New York after the storm of publicity that blew up around Taking in Water. The popular press attacked Luke for being anti-American. I mean, why this obsession with a Russian? Why not the American hero Shepherd? Of course, what mattered to Luke, to the work, was that Gagarin was the first human to see the Earth from space, not the space race. But America didn't want to be reminded that Russia had done anything first. So it wasn't about the work, it was about Luke, what toothpaste to use, what cigarettes did he smoke. Oh, and the invitations, he didn't discriminate. And of course the controversy made Andy furious. We'd walk up to 47th, hang around the factory. I was uneasy there. The tin foil on the walls, all the odd reflections. Andy had announced he wasn't doing any more paintings, only film. This drew Luke. The problem was Luke wanted to talk. He was a philosopher. At the factory, people were too cool to talk. Well, not the way Luke wanted to talk. People watched each other. Andy knew that Luke wanted to do a screen test, and one day He called him over to that silver couch. Next thing, Andy comes over to me, takes me down to where there's this high stool in front of a camera. He didn't say anything, just pointed. I sat on the stool and everyone knew what you had to do, just look at the camera. Andy set the film going and wandered off, supreme indifference. Luke would have cracked. 15 minutes staring down a camera lens, so Luke offered me. Everyone knew that sometimes Andy didn't put a film in, it was about watching how people would react, wanting their 15 minutes, then telling them after the ordeal there'd been no film in and you weren't supposed to mind. I hope there wasn't any film in the camera. That's partly how I managed it. Luke wanted it, not me. I was standing in for him, because he would have been compelled to speak. The one thing you mustn't do. Your face might start to reveal your inner life, but if you spoke, the end. Some people found the stool awkward. You were high up, staring at a cold object. I kept my eyes steady on the lens. That's what Andy wanted, a direct look. It was the only way he'd get eye contact, watching the films later, I mean. High up, staring, waiting. Oh, I knew how to do that. 15 minutes was easy.